alien race to come down and threaten us.
Is the singularity near?
The truth is out there.
The military-industrial complex.
The seven mountains of the influencers of culture.
To be as gods, you know.
Change has come to America.
Catapult of propaganda.
From a secure location on top of the ridge in the heart of the beautiful Missouri Ozarks, this is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
The coyotes are howling on the ridge, and that means it's time once again for A View from the Bunker live from a ridge overlooking the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. It's November 18th, 2018. California is burning. Florida has finally counted its votes. Israel just let Hamas win. Another flare-up in the war in Syria that could draw in the great powers. And the taxpayer-funded war on children. All this during our news segments tonight, and our special guest tonight will discuss a conspiracy in the 2nd century to twist the scriptures and hide prophecies of Jesus the Messiah. Doug Woodward talks about his forthcoming book, Rebooting the Bible, at the bottom of the hour. This is A View from the Bunker. Greetings and welcome, and appreciate you being here tonight. Please, if you haven't already, take advantage of the free mobile app. A View from the Bunker has its own mobile app, so if you missed the live program, and of course that makes it really easy to listen in and also to weigh in as the chat room is open at Spreaker.com. You can catch all of the archives, have them downloaded just directly to your smartphone or tablet, whether it's iOS or Android. You'll find links to the app stores, the iTunes App Store and Google Play at VFTB.net. That is the website where all of the archives are kept going back to 2009. Yes, we started this back in the early days of the internet, VFTB.net, our YouTube channel, where you can also find these archived as well, youtube.com/Derek Gilbert, where you'll also find some other video content that I upload there from time to time. And on social media, you'll find us at facebook.com/viewfromthebunker, Twitter @viewfrombunker, not enough letters, and new, we're using oneway.com, oneway.com/Derek P. Gilbert. So that's where you'll find us on the interwebs. Tonight, we're talking about a number of things, and of course, we have to start off with the California fires, which continue to burn. We understand now that there are as many as, nearly 1,300 people missing in the Camp Fire, which is the fire burning in Northern California. Just a huge amount of territory that's been burned there thus far. It is... oh, my goodness, 175,000 acres to this point? It's an incredible amount of territory that's been burned so far. And the death toll in the fire now is at 79. 76 in the northern fire. The Woolsey fire further south has 3 people have died in that fire so far. That fire about 88% contained. But the death toll in the Camp Fire in Northern California at 76, that fire only about 60% contained. And according to the experts in California, government officials there say that fire may continue to burn until at least the 30th. The fire only about 60% contained at this point, but may consume twice as much territory before it is finally done burning. This is a horrific thing. One of the things that hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention in the major media, and this concerns the southern fire, which is the Woolsey fire, the one that was burning in West Los Angeles County near Malibu, of course, claimed the home of some rather famous people, actors like Gerard Butler. Who was it? Anthony Hopkins, I believe. His home, the homes on either side of his were destroyed, but his, for some reason, managed to survive. And you know by now that Peggy Marzulli, their home, and the guest house in which they lived were both completely destroyed in the fire. L.A. posted a video to the internet earlier today showing the scene on the ground there, and just a few scraps of paper here and there, a couple of things left in the garden, but the house itself and all of the inventory, books, DVDs, CDs, just completely destroyed. And so if you'll check the notes, check LA's website, but I'll put in the notes also a link to LA's website if you'd like to contribute to help them rebuild and recover from the fire. They're renting a place now. They're hoping to get their dogs out of the kennel here in the next day or two and be reunited with them. But lamarzulli.wordpress.com is his website if you'd like to contribute to helping the Marzullis rebuild, lamarzulli.wordpress.com. But that Woolsey fire, in the course of its destruction, burned over a facility that was formerly owned by a contractor for the Atomic Energy Commission. This was a laboratory used to test weapons for the United States military, and it was the site of the worst nuclear meltdown in American history. Now, I'd always thought that the 3 Mile Island incident in Pennsylvania was the worst. That was in 1979, I believe. Or maybe earlier than that, because I remember watching the movie with Jack Lemmon, China Syndrome, which was based on the 3 Mile Island accident. Yeah, 1979 that was. But in 1959, at a facility called the Santa Susana Field Laboratory in Simi Valley, or Simi Hills, a sodium reactor that was being tested had to be vented by the researchers there, facility operators, to prevent it from overheating and exploding. And by the time the leaks were closed down, the site had released 459 times more radiation than was released at 3 Mile Island. This property, now owned by Boeing, remains contaminated with toxic materials, chemicals, as well as the nuclear material. And about 500,000 people live within about 10 miles of this facility. So the state's Department of Toxic Substances Control said that as of Friday, November 9th, an area of the site that was burned over posed no danger. Scientists and toxicologists checked it out, but there are those who are concerned. Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles, a group there that is concerned about this sort of thing, said that highly toxic materials embedded in the soil and vegetation may have been put into the air by the Woolsey fire. So, as if the destruction of the fire itself wasn't bad enough, the fact that it's burned over some very dangerous, toxic, and perhaps radioactive material is also part of the legacy of this the fires burning in California. Florida appears to have finally finished its recount. It had a noon deadline today, and gubernatorial candidate Democrat Andrew Gillum has conceded to Ron DeSantis. Conceded for the second time because he conceded on election night, and then he took it back. Senate Democrat Bill Nelson, who was running for re-election, conceded to outgoing Florida Governor Rick Scott. So the Republicans have taken both of those races there. The interesting thing, of course, this comes down to Broward County, Florida once again. The recount was, well, as we discussed last week and discussed during the week on Skywatch TV, the recount there was marred with, shall we say, irregularities. Just to be nice, the contest ended today, finally, at noon Eastern Time Sunday. Deadline passed there for county election officials to submit the results of a hand recount. And in the Senate race, Rick Scott was leading Nelson by about 10,333 votes. It's a very narrow margin of victory. That's about 1/8 of 1 percentage point, about 0.12%. The hand recount triggered when a machine recount showed that the two men were separated by about 12,600 votes. But interestingly, according to NBC, and I'm quoting now from NBC Story, Democrats originally had hoped that Broward County, where there were roughly 30,000 ballots on which machines either picked up multiple votes on the same ballot for the Senate race or no vote at all in that contest, known as overvotes and undervotes. So, I mean, you've got a margin of 12,600, Broward County, heavily Democrat, 30,000 votes in which machines picked up multiple votes on the same ballot or no vote at all. So they thought it was possible the machines had erred and simply not read valid votes for the Senate race correctly. But Broward County updated its website shortly before noon Sunday with new numbers showing that voters had simply not picked a candidate in the race, perhaps due to the design of the ballot. In other words, the embattled election commissioner there, Brenda Snipes, may have, the election supervisor in Broward County, because of the way she designed the ballot, may have confused voters, leading to 30,000 people not voting at all, which may, ironically, have given the Senate race to the Republican Governor Scott. So, and this after the results of the hand recount weren't submitted on time. During the machine recount, Brenda Snipes turned in the results 2 minutes after the court-ordered deadline, which was 3 o'clock Thursday. They were submitted at 3:02 p.m. Thursday, which meant the state said, sorry, under law, we cannot count these votes. Now, is it just a coincidence that the recount actually added 779 votes to the Republican candidate, Rick Scott? Bearing in mind that Brenda Snipes is a Democrat. But even so, that race is over, and Scott is the victor. Bill Nelson has conceded, and in the governor's race there, Andrew Gillum has conceded to the Republican Ron DeSantis. So Florida, Republican governor, Republican Senate. Now, another item of note this past week, and this is hitting close to home because of a book that I'm reading for some research, that the two, and this was a first that was trumpeted by the news media here in the United States, the first Muslim women elected to the United States Congress. It's kind of a milestone, and so we can understand why they would want to talk about this big change in the United States Congress. Ilhan Omar, who is a newly elected congresswoman or person, if you will, from Minnesota, and the new congresswoman from Michigan, who likewise, among the first Muslim women the first Muslim women ever elected to the United States Congress. Apparently, both women misled voters about their views on Israel prior to the election. Ilhan Omar, during the campaign, said that she felt that the BDS movement, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, which targets Israel by targeting businesses that have interest in Israel. Boycott, divest, or sanction. If you're a company that does business in Israel, the BDS movement wants to hurt you, and by extension then hurt the nation of Israel. Well, Omar said that the BDS movement was, what was her word? Counteractive, and didn't believe that it led to a two-state solution, which of course means Israel and the Palestinian Authority somehow working out a deal where the Palestinians actually get their own nation, that Israel finally concedes and recognizes the Palestinians as a nation. Well, after the election, of course, she has now come out and said exactly the opposite, that she believes in and supports the BDS movement. This is according to a release that her campaign sent to a website called Muslim Girl. Ilhan believes in and supports the BDS movement and has fought to make sure people's right to support it isn't criminalized. So, if you read any Muslim history at all, the history of Islam going back 1,400 years, this really shouldn't catch anyone by surprise. Because Muhammad basically enshrined in the religion, one of the revelations he was given by Allah is that Muslims who find themselves in positions of weakness surrounded by the kafir, the infidels, can say, do anything necessary to stay alive until they're in a position to turn the tables. This proved to be a real thorn in the side for the Spanish after the Reconquista, because Granada remained in Islamic hands until 1492, even though most of Spain was reclaimed by the, at least nominally, Christian Kingdom of Spain prior to 1492. But the Muslims of Granada would, profess to adhere to Christian values and the Christian religion, but they were essentially crypto-Muslims. And then when tables were turned, they would rise up and start killing and, rebelling and stuff like that, until finally in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella had enough and kicked him out of the country. In fact, I didn't realize this. I'm reading a book. In fact, I'll talk to the author tomorrow, and you'll hear the interview in just a few weeks. A book by author Raymond Ibrahim called Sword and Scimitar. And I didn't realize that Christopher Columbus was sailing west not to find new trade routes to India, but to try to find the kingdom of Prester John, at least in part. Prester John was a legendary Christian king who had gone off to the east somewhere, China or someplace, and set up a powerful Christian kingdom. The Spanish were looking for allies to help them attack Islam from the east because they were running into difficulty getting them from the west. I didn't realize that was part of Columbus's mission. Now, of course, when they found the New World and, heard rumors of gold and Fountain of Youth and all that other stuff, they got a little distracted. But apparently it was originally, nominally at least, for the purpose of trying to find to open a new front against the forces of Islam. Because after 700 years, 800 years of being, attacked, the Christian kingdoms of Europe were getting a little sick of it. So anyway, not really a surprise that both Ilhan Omar and the new representative from the Detroit area, Rashida Tlaib, both support and back the BDS movement after telling voters during the campaign that they didn't. So speaking of Israel, on Friday, there was a vote in the United Nations that kind of historic in that the United States finally stood up and took a stand on this particular resolution. It's kind of an annual thing at the United Nations to condemn Israel for occupying the Golan Heights. Well, Israel actually annexed the Golan Heights in 1981, but this move has not been recognized internationally. And so every year the United Nations will stand up and issue this resolution calling on Israel to rescind its authority, turn it back over to Syria. And for the first time, the United States Friday voted against the resolution, which meant that the vote was everybody voting yes versus Israel and the United States voting no. So a thank you to the Trump administration for taking a stand on a particular issue. The Golan Heights really isn't that big. It's about 1,200 square miles, captured in the 1967 war. And if you have any kind of understanding of military tactics at all, you recognize the strategic importance of the Heights because it overlooks the Sea of Galilee and some rather large cities down below like Tiberias and other areas in northern Israel that would be within range of, artillery, rocket fire, mortar fire. It would be a disaster. It's no surprise that Israel grabbed it and held on to it because strategically speaking, the Golan Heights are really, really important. But again, every year, just about since 1981, the United Nations sets a resolution saying, Israel, you stink, and the United States, instead of abstaining this year, finally said, no, we're not voting for that anymore. The political fallout from the Special Forces raid into Gaza last weekend, still ongoing. We're going to see some more stuff. In fact, in just a few hours, as we broadcast this tonight, it's 7 p.m., a little after 7 p.m. Central Time here, which means it is about 2 in the morning, if my math is right, in Israel. And it is expected that later this morning, a couple of ministers in the cabinet of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu are going to turn in their resignation. It appears that the raid that triggered the violence that broke out last weekend, almost 500 rockets in the span of a day launched into Israel by Hamas, was an attempt to install new spying gear in Gaza. Special forces went into the Gaza Strip trying to install espionage equipment, but they were discovered about 2 miles into Gaza and had to fight their way out. One soldier killed, identified only in the media so far as Lieutenant Colonel Mem, who was buried in northern Israel this past week. So the defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, wanted to go in and basically deal a severe blow to Hamas, and the IDF recommended against it. The Netanyahu administration agreed. Lieberman resigned, and because Netanyahu does not have a big majority in the Knesset, there are 120 seats in the Knesset, and the coalition government, as it stands now, has 61 seats. So that's a very narrow margin. If another coalition backs out, there will be snap elections, early elections, and nobody knows how that all is going to shake out. So Lieberman believes that it was rewarding Hamas for their terror. Hamas claimed victory in what goes on. Netanyahu said Hamas knows exactly why we did what we did, but we're not at liberty to tell the public, which, of course, doesn't help his cause politically. The party called Israel Home, most prominent politician there is the education minister, Naftali Bennett. The party basically demanded that Bennett replace Lieberman as defense minister. Now, I'm not real familiar with the personalities of the politicians involved, but from what I've read, if anything, Naftali Bennett is even more hawkish than Avigdor Lieberman. So Netanyahu has said, no, that's not going to happen. And so what's expected later today, this morning, Israel time, is that Naftali Bennett and the justice minister, also from the Israel Home Party, Ayelet Shaked, will resign. At least that's what's expected to happen. And if Israel Home withdraws and takes their 6 seats with them, then Benjamin Netanyahu will no longer have a majority in the Knesset, and that will trigger early elections. So that is still developing, and who knows how this is all going to shake out. Prime Minister Netanyahu is asking his coalition to hold together because the last time the government dissolved and had to go to elections during a crisis period like this, they wound up with the Oslo Accords, and we've seen how well that turned out. Netanyahu, by the way, has said that he is going to serve as his own defense minister. He's going to take that portfolio on himself for the first time. So, again, a lot of changes coming in Israel as we see Benjamin Netanyahu under fire for the decision to let the IDF off. Now, why did he do that? Caroline Glick, who's a columnist who's published at breakingisraelnews.com and a pretty smart person, had a couple of thoughts as to why that may have happened. She said there is no evidence that Benjamin Netanyahu is stupid. To the contrary, as for fear, there's ample evidence that if he and his ministers were fearful, they have good reason to be deeply worried. She points out that Israel does not want to overthrow the Hamas regime in Gaza because the price of overthrowing Hamas would be exorbitant in terms of humanity and the monetary cost. But at the same time, Hamas made it clear that the time has come for Israel to teach it a lesson, a terror regime capable of sending 500 projectiles into Israeli territory in less than a day and destroying a bus with an anti-tank missile. And thank God that the 50 soldiers who were on that bus had gotten off the bus before the anti-tank missile hit it and destroyed it. I mean, that's a near miracle there. That this means Hamas has gotten too powerful for its own good. So why didn't the cabinet order the IDF to go in and mow the grass in Gaza? That's a euphemism. One explanation, she says, is that the cabinet's decision to stand down was due to the general staff, that's the Israeli Defense Force, their refusal to take the actions necessary to cut Hamas down to size. The general staff's refusal, they say, stems from the role lawyers are now playing in the IDF's targeting decisions. And we've seen how well that works with the Obama administration, micromanaging targeting decisions on the ground in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. The other possible solution, which he says is equally troubling, is that Netanyahu and his ministers don't trust the IDF's operational competence. Both of those possible explanations, very, very disturbing. Just north of Israel in Syria, the army there has unleashed an assault on southeastern Idlib province. This is in the northwestern part of the country, and that's the one last holdout in Syria for the al-Qaeda-linked rebels that have been fighting against the president there, Bashar al-Assad, since 2011. There was an attack Friday by jihadists that left 22 Syrian soldiers dead. This was near what was supposed to be a buffer zone. Back in October, Russia and Turkey brokered a deal to try to create a buffer zone in the province there to eliminate the fighting. Now, Turkey, of course, has a vested interest in trying to keep the pressure on Bashar al-Assad. They're not friends, Turkey and Syria. I mean, Erdogan and Assad have no love for one another. But with Russia stepping in, and of course, as Syria's most powerful ally, Vladimir Putin has some say in what goes on inside Syria. But the Assad government has been critical of this deal that was hammered out in Sochi. Remember the name of that town? That's where the Olympics were held a couple years back. because they didn't like Turkey's role in Russia's ceasefire plan. So when the jihadists killed nearly 24 Syrian soldiers on Friday, that pretty much gave Assad the go-ahead to just call the whole thing off and to go after the Al-Qaeda-linked terrorists. The Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is the new name of the group. It was formerly the al-Nusra Front. Go after that group in force. Now, here's the thing. Back in September, Syria and Russia were going to go after these terrorist enclaves, and there was a threat, not very veiled threat, from the United States government saying that American forces might intervene on behalf of the Al-Qaeda-linked terrorists there. We've been basically fighting for Al-Qaeda in Syria with what we've been doing there in Syria for the last few years. God only knows why. So anyway, the Russians and Turks got together and said, okay, let's work out some kind of a deal where we can stop the shooting and just keep the Americans, at home. The question is whether if the fighting picks up again, and it looks like the last remnants of these Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria are on the ropes, will the Trump administration or will forces inside the American political class pressure the Trump administration into going to bat for the terrorists inside Syria? In other words, are we going to risk war over what's happening inside Syria? Pray that is not the case. And, I left one story here, and I think we can only touch on this now because I'd like to get into this in a little more detail. But we're coming up on the bottom of the hour here, and we're going to bring in our guest in just a few minutes. A disturbing story from the UK that a teacher who was quoted by the Daily Mail, which is one of the newspapers there. It's one of the red tops. It doesn't actually have a red banner on the top, but it's one of those newspapers where you kind of have to hold your hand over one side of the screen when you go to the website because half the stories are almost, R-rated as far as the images. Anyway, the Daily Mail quotes a teacher in Britain as saying that 17 students at her school are changing genders, and most of them undergoing the process are autistic, which raises the question of whether they really understand what it is they're doing or whether they've been pressured into this change because they've been convinced that changing gender will help them solve their problems. The Daily Mail describes the teacher as a 20-year veteran who asked not to be identified for fear of losing her job, which is telling in and of itself that there's a bureaucracy inside the public education system in the UK and likely here in the United States as well that would take action against the teacher for speaking out on this particular issue. Anyway, the teacher told the Daily Mail that she spoke out to protect the students. She believes schools and some politicians are peddling a politically correct fallacy driven by a powerful transgender lobby. She was told to keep parents and other teachers in the dark if a pupil claimed to be transgender. Older students who have changed gender are grooming younger ones to do the same, and one autistic teenager in her care scheduled to have a double mastectomy to change gender. She said many of the children believe they're the wrong sex because it helps them cope with problems caused by autism. This is consistent with the results of a survey or study done recently, published by a researcher from Brown University, one of the Ivy League schools, back in August. And then under pressure from the transgender lobby, Brown University then issued an apology. And the academic journal that published the study considered republishing the issue in which the study was published and taking it out. The question is, why? Why is there such pressure to convince teens, young people, that they are the wrong gender and take powerful drugs to prevent their bodies from developing the way they are genetically programmed? It's we'll talk about this more in our final segment after 8:30 tonight because there's more to this than this. This is not just some guy who's squeamish with the concept, kind of ranting about, look at the... That's not it at all. That's not it at all. I was socially really, really awkward when I was a kid growing up, and I'm afraid that when... that other kids who are in similar of similar personality coming up today, seeing the kind of social pressures, peer pressures that are being applied to them through the internet or being modeled for them by big names in Hollywood and the music business. Basically holding up people who say, I'm the wrong gender as heroes, encouraging children to do something. And this is being reflected in statistics showing an explosion in what researchers are calling sudden onset gender dysphoria. This wasn't even a thing 10 years ago. And the reason I'm bringing this up and get passionate about it is because the statistics of the activists behind this movement show that more than 40% of people who self-identify as transgender will try to kill themselves at some point. That is a rate of suicide or attempted suicide much higher than average. Something is wrong here, and we need to get out ahead of this and try to find an effective counter to it. Well, we'll talk more about that in an hour, but first, we got another important topic to discuss, and that is what our next guest describes as a second century conspiracy to change the Hebrew scriptures to hide prophecies that pointed to the coming Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. Doug Woodward joins us next. We're back in just a moment as A View from the Bunker continues. I'm Derek Gilbert.
We've been told that America is a Christian country from its origin, one nation under God. We've been taught that our government is for the people, by the people. But what if it's all been just a grand deception? What if the God, worshipped in secret by government leaders in our nation's capital, is in fact our enemy? And many of our leaders have been venerating him secretly through arcane rituals, setting the scene for the incarnation of this ancient entity.
They used the powerful energy of ninth-degree sex magic, through which the goddess Babylon herself might appear in human form.
What if everything we thought we knew about this great nation was designed to bring about the greatest conspiracy of all time? A conspiracy for the souls of humanity. What if I told you that America was founded by the darkest elite secret societies, and that there are still powerful remnants controlling hands in high positions, carrying this torch? Dr. Thomas Horn, William Ramsey, Russ Dizdar.
It's like God ripped open Hell's Kitchen and said, hey, here's some of the sequence of satanic evolution.
Colonel Robert McGinnis, Wes Fall, Carl Teichrob, Justin Fall.
It is the ritual that would ignite the resurrection of the Antichrist.
Belly of the Beast.
The holidays are rapidly approaching, and now's your chance to save big on the largest TV giveaway of the year. Skywatch TV is proud to announce the Belly of the Beast Grand Giveaway. In the brand new documentary, Belly of the Beast, you'll discover for the first time why a Bible is bound in a magic square inside the testes of the Washington Monument, where and why a buried ancient magical obelisk awaits underground nearby, where the entrance to a secret crypt exists connected to American Lucifer worship from within the deep state. And for the first time ever, the U.S. government-owned location where the Antichrist will be resurrected on American soil. When you order Belly of the Beast from Skywatch TV, you'll also receive Lady Queensborough's celebrated original 1933 Occult Theocracy 2-volume collection, beautifully republished by Defender Publishing. These books are classic exposés on the secret societies, from witches to Knights Templar, Freemasons to Rosicrucians, Druids to the Illuminati, Masonic and pagan symbols, Christian Science, the Order of the Jesuits, and so much more. Dr. Thomas Horn says no serious researcher's library is complete without this massive 2-volume collection. These 2 books alone hold a retail value of $80. Yours now, free when you purchase the Belly of the Beast Grand Giveaway. But we're just getting started. You'll also receive a gargantuan supply of brand new, super quality, overstock gift books, DVDs, audio sets, survival and organic living books, and more to add to your library or to give away as gifts this holiday season. Sold separately, this grand giveaway holds a retail value of over $350. Yours now for your donation of only $35 plus shipping and handling. So don't delay. This avalanche of holiday gifts is perfect for the serious researcher in your life, but is only available while supplies last. So take advantage of this, the largest Skywatch TV giveaway of 2018, while you can when you order the Belly of the Beast Grand Giveaway, now at the Skywatch TV store. Order online or call 1-844-750-4985.
Talking the Walk, live every Sunday night. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. VFTB.net, links there to where you can find us, and of course the free mobile app for iOS and Android devices. You'll find the links to the app stores there as well. Millennials triggered. They can't even, because Hasbro has a new edition of Monopoly. Monopoly for Millennials. Find out why it is driving them to, well, I don't know about drink, but they need a safe space, thanks to Hasbro, and that we'll talk about that in our final segment tonight after 8:30. Joining us now, an author who is behind a number of books that we recommend, including Power Quest Volumes 1 and 2, Lying Wonders of the Red Planet, Uncommon Sense, The Next Great War in the Middle East, and The Revealing. His new book is one that's got a compelling title, an intriguing title, and perhaps even a controversial title, Rebooting the Bible, Exposing the Second Century Conspiracy to Corrupt the Scripture and Alter Biblical Chronology. We welcome to the program Doug Woodward. Doug, good to talk with you again, brother.
Hey, it's always good to be online with you and to have a chance to visit with your audience, and always enjoy the time together because you are always thoughtful and ask great questions.
Well, you're very kind. I appreciate that. Doug, this book is, this is going to probably step on some toes because if you're claiming, and we'll give you a chance here to do the elevator pitch, I guess, as far as what the premise of the book is. But if you're claiming that the Bible isn't the way it was originally written, boy, that's a kind of a risky position to stake out and defend.
Yeah, it certainly is going to require some explanation because I think that the Bible that there was an autograph, there were autographs, there were of course original books written, and the question is the Bible that we have today, that we Protestants have today, is derived from what we call the Masoretic text, and but it's of course the Protestant Bible, and a key thing to understand is that it's different than the Bible that the Catholics use and the Bible that the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox or the Greek or Russian Orthodox Church uses. So that's really what the book is going to dig into, is this whole issue of what's the difference between the Masoretic text and predominantly the Septuagint, which is the Greek text, and the position that I take and that the book takes is that the Greek Septuagint, which was written quite some time before the New Testament, the Old Testament, Greek Septuagint, was written in part as early as 280 BC in Alexandria, Egypt, and it was completed by about 130 BC. And but the Masoretic text is the text that's basically in the Protestant Bibles, and is what we have come to see in virtually, certainly the King James Bible and every other Protestant Bible. And so I'm going to challenge the fact that what we Protestants have been using is actually not as authentic as the Bible that the Greeks, that the Greek Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, has been using. And so I expect that I'm not going to just step on some toes. I'm going to step on both feet.
Yeah. There are some who, well, of course, the old joke is, the King James version. If it was good enough for John the Baptist, it's good enough for me.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree.
And that's not to say, I don't want to, demean anybody or just ridicule anyone, because I look at the King James Bible. The King James translation was an excellent translation, but
sure.
They worked with what they had at the time.
Right.
Now, the Septuagint, and it's funny that we're having this conversation tonight because it came up in our Bible study this morning. Sharon and me were talking about the book of Daniel and how Daniel, being in the Old Testament, had to be in the Septuagint, which it is, which was translated, as you say, sometime in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, which means it was completed long before the birth of Jesus, and yet it called to the year, certainly, and Chuck Missler argued to the day, the triumphant arrival of Jesus into Jerusalem, his triumphal entry. So even if skeptics want to deny that a man named Daniel living in Babylonia wrote down those words that are in the Old Testament, somebody compiled it at least about 200 years before Jesus was even born. But how did the Septuagint come to be, Doug? I mean, what was the reason that these scholars decided to sit down and say, we need to take these original Hebrew texts and turn them into Greek?
Right. Well, it turns out that there was in Alexandria, Egypt, this was not that long after Alexander the Great had come through. Many remember the story of him coming through Jerusalem and actually being well received, and he was really quite impressed with the Jews, the temple, and actually was very amenable because he was shown the book of Daniel, and it was discussed with him the fact that he was likely the he-goat that was going to go about the process of conquering Persia. And so he thought that was pretty cool, and so he was very receptive. And so not long after going through Israel, he went to Alexandria, Egypt, where he founded that city around 325 or so BC. And within 40 years, of course, he died about 321 BC, and his kingdom was split up into 4 different sections, and one of those sections was Egypt and northern Africa. And Ptolemy was the first Ptolemaic, as it's known, king. His name was Soter, and he was really the king at the time when the Septuagint was written and it was translated. And so there is a tremendous amount of legend and stories surrounding it. But according to Josephus and Philo and some other historians, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Pentateuch, was translated around 280 BC, and what supposedly had occurred, as some of your listeners may know, was that Alexandria had a massive library, which had potentially over 500,000 volumes, but it didn't have a copy of the Hebrew Bible. And so one of the curator of the museum suggested that they should have a copy of the Hebrew Bible. And the story goes, is told by a fellow named Aristeas, in the so-called the letter of Aristeas, that the king, that Ptolemy I, should request that the scribes, the high priest Eleazar in Jerusalem should send 72 scribes and scholars of the Hebrew Bible to Alexandria, and that the king wanted a Greek translation made of the Bible for the Alexandrian library. And so whether or not the story happened exactly as it's recounted in the letter of Aristeas, the concept of the Septuagint, which stands for Septua, or the 70 in Roman, we think of Roman numerals LXX, the Septuagint, which is the abbreviation. The 70 refers to the fact that there were supposedly 70 or possibly 72 scholars that actually did the translation. And according to the letter of Aristeas, it was done in 72 days. And again, this was just the first 5 books of the Bible, although it's possible it may have included Judges and Joshua as well. And so it came about as a result of wanting to have a volume in the library of Alexandria. It turns out that the Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt, Egypt was very significant. Perhaps almost as many as a third of the citizens were Jewish. For a variety of reasons, they had settled in Alexandria really throughout the 700 years leading up to the time of Christ, and so there was this big contingent, and so it was convenient for the Jews because most of the Jews throughout the diaspora spoke Greek. They didn't speak Hebrew, and so the idea of having a Greek Bible was a great thing.
We're talking with Doug Woodward. His forthcoming book is called Rebooting the Bible. It's about the Septuagint, the original Hebrew on which it was based, and how it differed from the Masoretic text. Now, what is the Masoretic text on which our Protestant Bibles are based?
Yeah, well, it's there's this thing called the Vorlage, Vorlage, and what's important to know is that the Vorlage that was used for the translation of the Septuagint in 280 BC likely came from perhaps a first-generation copy of the actual Bible that was in the temple in Jerusalem, and a copy came with the scribes that would do the translation, and that Vorlage was, and turns out to be, and generally accepted by virtually all scholars in New Testament textual criticism today, that it was an earlier and somewhat different Bible or Vorlage than the Vorlage that we have come to know that became part of the Masoretic text, and so there's a separation of almost 400 years between these two. And of course, the key to the story is that the Vorlage that became the Masoretic text, and the claim that I make, which I spend a goodly amount of the book documenting, is that it was intentionally corrupted by the rabbis that came together not long after the temple was destroyed in a little city outside of what today is Tel Aviv, called Javne, or Jamnia in English. And there are many Jewish scholars that actually support this position, that the rabbis, in part to attempt to save their religion from becoming fully Christianized, decided the best thing to do was to take what was becoming the Christian Bible, which was the Greek Septuagint, and was to alter it. And the way they did that first was to create a new Hebrew Vorlage that modified the chronology in the Old Testament, predominantly in Genesis 5 and 11, and also to change the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. And that's, in fact, what they did. And part of the book, what I do is I show how the prophecies in the Masoretic text differ from the prophecies in the Septuagint, and how the Septuagint actually shows, or actually illustrates better, that Jesus was, in fact, the Messiah. And the reason that Christians that were not that aware of this is because the New Testament, when it cites the Old Testament, it's actually citing the Septuagint. It's not citing the Hebrew in about 90% of the cases. And so consequently, we're not that aware of the fact that the Old Testament had been changed.
Ah, okay. All right.
And so, and of course, what's one of the major factors which the book goes into great length at is that the chronology of Genesis 5 and 11, which takes us really from Abraham all the way back to Adam, that chronology is in fact very different in the Septuagint than it is in the Masoretic text. What we learn is that the Septuagint's chronology is approximately 1,500 years longer than the Masoretic text, or the famous chronology of Bishop Ussher, and what we see in Genesis 5 and 11 in our Protestant Bibles. We're familiar with the concept of the 4004 BC when God created the universe and created Adam and Eve. The Septuagint actually says that occurred 1,500 years earlier. The date that I have calculated based upon all the research I did was 5,600 or 5,616 BC. Again, about almost almost 16. It's actually just slightly more than 1,600 years longer than the timeline given in the in the Masoretic. And so it has pretty big implications in terms of the timing of the flood, the timing of the Tower of Babel, and so forth. And so it actually enables the possibility that we can synchronize much better what's known as primeval or ancient history in the Bible with what is found today in both Egyptology as well as archaeology in Mesopotamia.
Well, now you're talking. That this is my bread and butter the last few years. This stuff really gets my interest. So now I'm really curious about that, Doug. Why would that difference be important to these Jewish scholars in the early 2nd century? The group that gathered at Jamnia. Is that the
it's Jamnia. Javneh.
Javneh.
Javneh is the way it's said in Israel.
Yeah, the correct way then, I guess.
But it's Jamnia is the way we talk about it. Well, the real difference, the real reason, and this goes into, we have just a tremendous amount of documentation that the church fathers knew this, and they talked about this, and they accused the rabbis of making these changes, and they all said it was for the same reason. The reason was that there was a strong belief that the Messiah would come in the 6th day, and that he would come sometime in the 6th millennium, or between 5,000 and 6,000 years after Adam and Eve, walked in the Garden of Eden. And so, whereas today, of course, Derek, you're well aware that we talk in terms of, the Lord is going to come back soon because there's been 6 days or 6,000 years, and the millennium will be the 7,000 year. Well, what we don't know, and I didn't know this. In fact, almost everything I'm telling you, I've only learned over the last year through my research, is that the church fathers believed that Jesus had come around 5,500 years after Adam, and that he would come again within 500 years. So they felt that that Jesus' second coming would happen sometime in the 5th or 6th century A.D. because of that. So they actually had the same concept that we do. The difference is that they saw the world as 1,500 years older than we do today. Those of us that may believe in either a literal 6,000 years, or of course the Septuagint is basically now 7,600 years. And so given that that situation, it's going to be pretty remarkable, because it has a big impact upon those that are young earthers and those that believe that the world is a young earth.
Sure.
So so it has a big impact on that as well.
Well, this too wouldn't this suggest that if they were going by the original dates on the Hebrew texts that the translators of the Septuagint used, that the timing of Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, which I mentioned in my book, was a symbol of kingship. I mean, we here in the West, with the Marlboro Man image, we think of the horse as the, more appropriate for a king, but that wasn't the case in the ancient Near East. Soldiers rode on horses or camels, but the donkey was reserved for the king. And there are texts that show this, ancient Amorite texts from the time of Abraham, with an advisor to an Amorite king saying, if you want to honor your kingship, you don't ride on a horse, ride in a chariot, or ride on the back of a donkey. So when people, when Jesus showed up, and I document this with scholars who agree with this interpretation, it's like, Jesus knew what he was doing, and everybody in Jerusalem knew what he was doing. Here comes the king riding on a donkey. That's why he's riding on a donkey. But the timing, though, if that would have been considered roughly 5,600 years after creation when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, the timing would fit, but that's not something that a Jewish rabbi would have wanted to admit. The Jewish rabbis did not want the people to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, because not only did they change
after the death of Christ and after the temple had been destroyed, did they change the chronology of the Old Testament. We got to keep in mind that the Jews generally, nobody had a Bible back then, or very few did. Perhaps the synagogues did, but most people couldn't read the Hebrew to begin with. All right, so but we also know that not only did the rabbis change, and I can go and explain more about how they changed the chronology in a moment, but they also changed the timing in the book of Daniel. They cut out about 185 years out of the history in the book of Daniel, so that Christ would not be seen, Jesus would not be seen to fulfill the prediction in Daniel. And so they changed both of those. They did this other change we're talking about as it relates to the book of Daniel in what is known as the Seder Olam Rabbah, which was written by a disciple of Rabbi Akiva, who's kind of the heavy in my book. This was done about 160 AD, whereas the changes in the Hebrew, what became, we call it really the proto-Masoretic text. It would become the Masoretic text, but not really for another 700, 800 years. But anyway, the Seder Olam changed the dates in relative to Daniel by cutting out, as you I'm sure know, Derek, about a half dozen or more of the Persian kings in that interim period from the time when the Jews returned to Jerusalem until the Messiah Jesus came. And yes, so go ahead.
No, I was going to just to reiterate now. You mentioned the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Greek Orthodox churches. Their Old Testament is they're still using the Septuagint because it's in the Greek.
Yeah, they still use the Septuagint, and they have felt that the church all along was using the Septuagint. And we know that the church for the first 500 years or so, the Greek Bible was the Bible of the church. Virtually none of the church fathers, the only church father that really understood Hebrew was Origen. All of the other church fathers worked specifically in Greek, and so the whole issue of Origen. I go into, of course, all the detail about the different church fathers, what they believed about this, and basically show that they were all in sync with what I'm communicating relative to the time between Adam and Christ and so forth, and also the view that Augustine, in fact, said the same, that the Jews, the rabbis, had actually changed the text to, in effect, keep the people from believing that Jesus was the Messiah, and so it is a blockbuster conspiracy to say the least.
Now, this Rabbi Akiva that you mentioned is a really interesting character who played a very important role in the Bar Kokhba revolt in
that's correct.
Yeah, in the 130s AD, because he's the one who proclaimed Simon Bar Kokhba as the fulfillment of Numbers 24:17. I see a star rising, Jacob, and of course Bar Kokhba means son of the star. So Akiva had his own candidate for the Messiah, and of course prophecies in the Old Testament that pointed to somebody other than Simon would not do. So was that behind this, or was this something, or was there just, or did it begin with we need to try to eliminate these texts that these annoying Christians are using as for apologetics?
Right, exactly. Well, that was certainly one of the main things, but it turned out that Bar Kokhba and Akiba's support of Bar Kokhba was historically extremely significant. Rabbi Akiba really is the father of rabbinic Judaism, and what most Christians don't realize is the fact that the Pharisees were the only really surviving sect after the temple was destroyed. The scribes, the Sadducees, the Essenes, they were all gone. They were basically eliminated. There was no longer a need for the priests because there was no temple. And so the only sect, if you will, and the Pharisees really were a sect that existed after the temple was destroyed as we enter into the 2nd century AD, were the rabbis, and the rabbis were the Pharisees. And most people don't realize that, but that is the case. the Pharisees, of course, were very focused on the law, as we know, and we certainly remember the squabbles that occurred between Jesus and the Pharisees. Mm-hmm. The Pharisees would continue to persist in the focus on the externalization of the law, if you will, that their desire, and they created first the Mishnah and then the sometimes called the Gemara, but ultimately the Talmud, which is both. And what they were seeking to do was to create a sort of picket fence around the law of God. Mm-hmm. And by saying that, what I'm saying is that they were attempting to make the law more black and white, so that it was clear how and when they might transgress the law, and by building a fence around it, it would keep them from doing so. So in effect, they created all of their various traditions, some of which, of course, that were already well in place by the time of Jesus. And these traditions, which he, of course, as you well know and your audience will know, Jesus insisted these were not the laws of God, they were the laws of men. And so anyway, the rabbis began to focus on the Mishnah, which was really the writing down of the so-called oral law, which they claimed was given to Moses at the same time the written law was given on Mount Sinai. So anyway, the rabbis and Rabbi Akiba, he was, of course, attempting to get people to move away from the notion of Jesus as the Messiah and to focus instead on a political military Messiah, which is kind of the common view that we all sort of know, that the Jews sort of had this idea that the Messiah would be a military conqueror. Mm-hmm. Well, Simon Bar Kokhba much better fit that portrayal. And there's really a tremendous amount of information that people don't know about the wars between the Romans and the Jews. The war that is known as the Great Revolt, the temple that destroyed the temple, that's only the start. There were two more major wars, and the third war, which involved Bar Kokhba, was the largest of all three.
Doug,
and it was massive in scale. Yeah, and I do talk about that in the book.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
We're going to pick that up on the other side, because I've done some reading on the Bar Kokhba revolt, and I think that has a lot to do with the way things shook out. So we'll pick up there. And also, when we continue our discussion, want to talk about how this how we can reconcile this with the concept that God preserves his word. I mean, if Rabbi Akiba and his colleagues in the 2nd century were able to change the Old Testament and change the Old Testament that has been used to translate our modern Protestant Bibles, how do we reconcile it with the idea that God's preserved his word? We're talking with Doug Woodward. His forthcoming book is called Rebooting the Bible, Exposing the 2nd Century Conspiracy to Corrupt the Scripture and Alter Biblical Chronology. Stay with us. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.
For thousands of years, mankind has debated how creation began. Ancient texts tell us the story. But today, the real message behind the pivotal account of the Garden of Eden has been obfuscated and lost. That is, until now. World-renowned author Carl Gallups digs up the hidden truths from the book of Genesis to finally give back the knowledge that was lost to the world. Find out what really happened in the Garden of Eden, what Jesus taught about Eden on the cross, and how the conflict between Jesus and the gods of antiquity is about to erupt on planet Earth, fulfilling biblical prophecy. In the new book, Gods of Ground Zero, this explains everything.
A new take on the prophesied war of Gog and Magog. Forget about Russia coming from the uttermost parts of the north. The enemy foreseen by the prophet Ezekiel is so much bigger and so much older. It's Last Clash of the Titans by Derek P. Gilbert, a #1 new release in Amazon's Christian history category. Last Clash of the Titans breaks down step by step how Greek mythology grew out of Canaanite religion, why the old gods of the Greeks, the Titans, were the watchers who descended on the summit of Mount Hermon, and why the Titans will return from the abyss for one final battle against God. Armageddon. Last Clash of the Titans, backed up by peer-reviewed academic research. Tom Horn calls this book stunning. Last Clash of the Titans, the second coming of Hercules, Leviathan, and the prophesied war between Jesus Christ and the gods of antiquity. Get it as part of a special offer at skywatchtvstore.com and available now in paperback and as a Kindle ebook at amazon.com. A man, a microphone, in the middle of the Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Next week, the occult origins behind the formation of these United States. It's a shocking new documentary called Belly of the Beast, and we'll talk with the filmmakers Justin Fall and Wes Fall. That's next week, November 25th, on A View from the Bunker. So what happened in the early 2nd century as part of the revolution by the Jews against Rome that led to a group of rabbis in the town of Javne deciding to twist the Old Testament scriptures into something that de-emphasized the divinity of Jesus? We're talking with Doug Woodward. His forthcoming book is... and, of course, I had it right here, and the brain is not following and tracking with my notes. There we go. Rebooting the Bible. Got it right there on the big 4-foot by 8-foot whiteboard right in front of my face. Even got it underlined. Well, Doug, thanks again for sticking through the break there. And the history, as you say, of Israel, the history, frankly, of the Eastern Roman Empire, which later we call the Byzantine Empire, we've kind of forgotten here in the modern church. We sort of think that the Bible is written in kind of a bubble. The apostles and prophets, all that they knew is what they heard from Jesus. They didn't know anything about what their neighbors believed or anything like that. And obviously that's untrue. After the fall of Jerusalem to the Roman legions in the year 70, life didn't stop in Jerusalem. People still lived there. They rebuilt, and there was still a Christian community and a Jewish community left in Judea that was there for another 63, 65 years until finally the Bar Kokhba revolt, when the Emperor Hadrian said, "That's it, I've had enough. We're going to get all of you people out of there." And that's when the name of the place was changed from Judea to Palestine, because Hadrian was so disgusted, so frustrated with these annoying Jews that kept rebelling against the Roman Empire. But until the Bar Kokhba revolt, as I understand it, Christians and Jews pretty much lived side by side in a lot of communities in Judea. But when Akiva said, "This is the Messiah," Christians said, no, we know the Messiah, and Simon's not him, and they refused to fight. And that was like the final break between Jews and Jewish Christians, or Messianic Jews, if you will. And so how did that affect then the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures that were translated or at least preserved by the Jews in Hebrew, but then modified over the centuries following Bar Kokhba?
Right. Well, many of us have known for quite some time that the canon of the New Testament wasn't really settled until about roughly 360 to 380. The letter from I'm trying to think of Athanasius, the letter of Athanasius, the Easter letter, that sort of settled the canon of the New Testament scripture in the 4th century. But the canon of the Jewish Bible was not really settled until the rabbis at Jamnia decided on that canon around 105, 110 A.D. All right, and so. But part of their decision, they had been, of course, following and using what we know as the Apocrypha now, but they got rid of the Apocrypha, and they settled on just the books that we see in the Protestant Bible. All right, and so that was that was their call, that was their decision at that time, and what they decided to do, what they believed they needed to do, was they needed to sort of staunch the flow from from many Jews becoming Christians. They needed to create a Hebrew Vorlog that then could be used as the basis for a new Greek translation that would replace the Greek translation we call the Septuagint, which is also known as the Old Greek. And it turns out over the next 70 years or so, there were in fact 3 new Greek translations that were created. All of them had their roots with the rabbis at Jamnia. The first was by Aquila, and it was considered a very, very literal word-for-word translation. In other words, almost unreadable. Because when you move from one language to another, a lot of stuff just doesn't come across very well.
Right.
And and so
sentence structure changes. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a whole study about a thing called dynamic equivalence and formal equivalence and translation and so forth. I talk about quite a bit of this in the book as well in terms of the challenges associated with translation. But a second translation was written by a guy named Symmachus and a third by a guy named Theodotion. And these 3 translations were all written in the 2nd century, but they were all based on the new Hebrew Vorlog that had been modified by the rabbis at Jamnia. And it's not the thing that as I've gotten to be more and more into the Septuagint. And by the way, I'm not rejecting altogether the Old Testament, the Masoretic text, but I have to explain there's factors about it that we have to take into account and we need to be aware of. And one of them is as you compare, which one of the chapters of the book does, you look at the messianic prophecies in the Masoretic text as translated in the King James, and you compare it then with the messianic prophecies in the New Testament that were from the Septuagint. You see again and again and again that the messianic prophecies were watered down and that they were obfuscated, and in some cases the way of salvation was removed or was changed from grace back to the law. And so I isolate about 28 verses, but it's just the beginning.
If you could pick out one, is there one verse or say that you could give as an example for how say a messianic prophecy was changed and watered down?
Let me jump to that. In certainly it's talked about, I think, Psalms 40 verse 6. I was going to go down here and find it where I've got it so I can read it properly and not mess up, because I don't have all of the Bible memorized. I'd like to, but I just don't have that.
I hear you.
Yet.
I'm kind of the same way. It's like, I think I read that somewhere, and it's somewhere in that part of the Bible, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, the famous verse, of course, is about, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. And it was definitely one of the first things they changed in the Old Testament was changing the word from virgin to young woman. So that's probably the most famous alteration. Okay. But I'm seeing if I can find, let's see, this is the one. I'm looking at my index here. Number 6, Hebrews 10:5 with Psalms 40 verse 6. All right, and so this one's fairly spectacular here. Let's see. I can't.
Well, I've got the ESV version open here, Psalm 40 verse 6.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead and read that if you want to.
The English Standard Version, which is a modern word-for-word translation, renders Psalm 40 verse 6 this way: in sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but you have given me an open ear. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required.
Okay. Notice it says, you have given me an open ear. All right. Now go to, since you've got it there, go to Hebrews 10 verse 5 and read the way that the writer to the book of Hebrews quotes Psalms 40 verse 6.
Okay. Hebrews 10 verse 5 reads, consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, and this is quoting the psalm now, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure.
Yeah, so it doesn't say that God gave him an ear. It says that God gave him a body.
Yeah.
So, he provided the Messiah a body, something that the Jews didn't really want to acknowledge, that the God of the Old Testament was going to send forth his Messiah,
right,
and provide for him a human body.
But in the King James, it reads this way: "Sacrifice and offering thou didst not desire; mine ears hast thou opened," which is even a little
quite different, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So, so folks, again, most of us, we weren't sensitive to this because, generally speaking, we've read the New Testament and the quotations in the New Testament. And those quotations, 90% of the time, are from the Septuagint. And that was the Bible of the early church. It wasn't really until about the 6th century, or even the 7th century, when the Latin Vulgate that Jerome wrote became more or less adopted and began to push aside in the Western church the Septuagint. The Vulgate was written in part predominantly actually with the Masoretic text, with a bit of the Septuagint primarily in the Psalms. But the point I should make is that when you get to the time of the Reformation, you have the Reformers. You have Martin Luther predominantly, who led the way, and he said, well, the Catholics have the Vulgate, and we hate the Catholics, and the Orthodox, they have icons, we hate the Orthodox, and they use the Septuagint. So we need to really let's really be more authentic. Let's go back to the Hebrew. Let's go to the Hebrew Bible, and we will use the Masoretic text, the same text that the Hebrews use, and that will be the basis for our Bible. Mm-hmm. Well, that would seem like that was well and good, but unfortunately, what Luther didn't know is that he fell into the trap that Rabbi Akiva set up for Protestants. We used the Old Testament that they had corrupted, and they corrupted it in many, many ways. And, of course, this is for those folks that are King James only people, and I know there's lots and maybe some that listen to your program. They're going to say, oh my gosh, you're saying that the King James was corrupted. Well, I would say yes, but just the Old Testament. Happily not the New Testament, because it quotes the Septuagint.
That's right, the New Testament.
So I'm
citations
definitely step on a lot of people's feet.
Yeah,
or all their toes there.
Well, the New Testament was written in Greek because that was the language of the land, certainly of the learned people in the first century, and that was the Bible that they had available to them then, was the Septuagint translation. So that would have been the one they cited. We're talking with Doug Woodward. His forthcoming book is called Rebooting the Bible, on A View from the Bunker. The question that this raises, of course, and you allude to this, you just alluded to it. How do we then defend the authenticity of Scripture if we're saying, well, these rabbis in the first century were able to just massage the Old Testament when they translated their version of Hebrew, which then got worked into our modern English translations? How can we defend the authenticity, the accuracy of Scripture?
Well, I certainly believe that we can. I believe in an inerrant, infallible Word of God. I believe that the original autographs of the Hebrew were, in fact, fully inspired and inerrant. However, what we have to recognize is that it was the original authentic texts that were used in Alexandria in 280 BC when the Greek Septuagint was created. And it's possible that the actual sort of authentic texts in the temple, in fact, were taken or destroyed and taken by Titus back to Rome. It's possible that that the Jews lost the actual we'll say autographs, or the earliest copy that existed that had not been basically destroyed through the ravages of time, and so it's possible that they were still working. They were working from copies even then, and of course, when they began to rework in effect, recreate the Hebrew Vorlog, they were working with definitely a Hebrew text that was different than the Hebrew text that the Alexandrian scholars were working with. We know this in part because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what's interesting is that you have a number of Jewish scholars. In fact, one of the more famous is a guy named Emanuel Tov, and essentially, as they have began to study the Dead Sea Scrolls more and more and begin to compare the Septuagint with the Masoretic, what we read is that the Septuagint has become regarded as the preferred, most authentic source of the original Hebrew, right? And so, yes, the Lord has allowed the rabbis to alter the Scripture, but the Church of Jesus Christ has always maintained the Septuagint as the closest to the authentic Hebrew for the Old Testament. And it did this predominantly, of course, for those verses that mattered the most to us, the Messianic prophecies, by those verses being cited, about 280 of them in the Christian New Testament.
And, when we go into the Old Testament, we can still see that there are many of those messianic prophecies that are still very clear, like, Psalm 22. Yes. It's still very clear. Isaiah, what is the chapter there that the rabbis even today will not read? Isaiah 54?
53.
Isaiah 53. So, even with the changes that may have been made in the Masoretic text, there are still some very, very plain.
Absolutely, and that's of course the wonderful thing is that the plan of God is not thwarted by the wiles of men, if you will. The King James Bible has still been used to convert millions upon millions of both Gentiles and Jews into the faith, and so the point that becomes probably important for us is as we study the Scripture, we need to not just look at the Masoretic text only. We need to look at both. Then one of the nice things about the ESV version is that it seriously considers both. And although it does not usually put in line the Septuagint reading, it always provides the Septuagint reading in the marginal or the footnotes. Mm-hmm. And so we happily have that. The ESV also utilizes the Dead Sea Scrolls for clarification as well.
Right.
So that's why it's one of perhaps for me it's become my favorite text, our favorite Bible at this time. So we need to be a good Bible student is going to be studying both and be aware of the fact that there were changes. The more I dive into this, and again, a lot of the book, of course, I'm dealing with chronology. Another time we'll talk about Egypt and the chronology in Egypt, the judges and all that, because I get into all of these things. But once you dig into the Septuagint, you begin to discover changes and differences in various places. Some of them are minute, some of them are fairly significant. If you do a comparison of the Proverbs, I was looking at this last night, it is remarkable how much change was made in the Proverbs. And in fact, one of the comments was many of the Proverbs were changed because they were changed by, in effect, the misogynist rabbis that were going through and indicating all the ways in which women should be sequestered and made submissive and so forth, because it's very different in the Septuagint from what is in the Masoretic text. So, I discovered other things. I discovered that, for instance, in 1 Kings 6:1, that talks about the length of time from the commandment that Solomon gave to begin to build the temple until the Exodus, that it's in the Masoretic, it's 480 years. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out that in the Septuagint, it's 440 years. And that becomes very significant in actually understanding the calculation of when the Exodus actually occurred. And so one of the things that the book does is that there's a heavy emphasis on the chronology, and it may not have come across yet in our discussion. But what I do is I go back and I show the errors in chronology during the time of the kings of Judah and Israel. Then I go into the time of the judges, which is the most difficult period during the sort of history of the Hebrews to understand the chronology of the people, and but then from that point moving back into the Exodus, and when the Exodus occurred, and then how long was the so-called sojourn of Abraham and his descendants in Egypt, and I have to go through all of these things. And once you go through all of these things and you actually begin to nail down when the Exodus occurred, once you understand that, you can then understand when Abraham was born. And once you understand when Abraham was born, you can walk it all the way back to the creation in Genesis chapter 1.
Yeah, I was curious about that because, again, that's something I've done a fair bit of research on. My chronology, I'm not sure how it tracks with yours, but I've got Abraham entering Canaan around 1876 BC.
Possibly earlier. I have to go look because I don't have all those things memorized. Abraham was born in about according to the Septuagint around 2180 BC.
All right.
And one of the key questions, Derek, to look at is whether the Jews were enslaved for 400 years or for roughly 100 years. And when you look at and compare the words of Paul in Galatians and Stephen in, I believe, chapter 7 of Acts, it looks as if that there was the 430-year period, but half of that period really related to the time of Abraham sojourning with his son and grandson, basically in Canaan.
Yeah, and I agree with that.
Yeah, and so that looks pretty clear. And so in fact the other thing I'll say to mention this to the audience, we're running out of time, is the movie Patterns of Evidence that was done 2 years ago or less,
right,
by Tim Mahoney and the Egyptologist David Roll. I rely upon that a lot. However, I have found mistakes or things that the Egyptologist David Roll talks about that don't square with the Scripture, and yet much of what he says is very, very helpful, very enlightening. But both of them together in the book, they conclude that the Exodus likely occurred about 1650 BC, but they won't stand by it. And so they back off and they go with what is the more traditional conservative view, which is 1440 BC.
Right.
And even and many conservatives even date it as late as 1280 BC. But what I've done in the book, thanks to some research and perhaps some enlightenment from the Lord above, is be able to identify what is the likely date of the Exodus, which is probably 1628 BC, probably coinciding with the explosive volcanic eruption at Thera in the Aegean Sea. And so, again, I go through and look at all the evidence for that, look at quite a few scholars, and then based upon the chronology, following it all the way from the time of the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BC all the way back to the Judges, and then beyond the Judges back to the Exodus, it looks like that is in fact the date. So when the relevance from an apologetic standpoint is once you understand these things, all of a sudden it's much more likely that we can nail down when the Tower of Babel occurred and when the flood occurred. And they occurred about, roughly, this is very rough, about 1,000 years earlier than the dating of Bishop Ussher and the dating that's in the Genesis 5 and 11. Probably better fits with the dating that you came up with in your book on Egypt.
Yeah, I would agree.
And so you'll find that very helpful, I think.
Yeah, well, we're going to need to sit down and have some coffee and just talk about the history of Egypt and the Hyksos period and the Amorites and how this all fits together, because I think it's a bigger picture that really helps understand better what was in the minds of the prophets and the apostles. Just with a couple of minutes left, Doug, the research that you've done here, how has this affected or changed maybe your reading of the Bible?
Well, I'd say that for me, it is. I actually have a higher degree of regard for the authenticity of the Scripture and the inspiration of the Scripture, because I do believe that the Bible presents, once you understand the proper dates, the Bible gives us very precise dates. Now, what I believe Adam and Eve were created. The calculation I have is 5616 BC, and I think that's correct. Now, different question as to whether or not that was the creation of the universe. Could there be something that happened before that? Is the world young? I tend to be more of a gap theorist myself. And so while identifying a date of when Adam and Eve were created as a special creation by God, that doesn't mean that I'm a young earther. However, the dates that I've seen and researched and come up with actually strengthen the case for those that wish to be young earthers, because it overcomes some of the sort of irreconcilable differences between the archaeology of Mesopotamia and Egyptology and what the Bible says about ancient history. Armed with a Septuagint, you can better reconcile biblical history with secular history that's been basically dug up by the archaeologists over the last 200 years.
So, Doug, the book, when will it be officially available? Where will people be able to find a copy of Rebooting the Bible?
Yeah, well, I'm going to try to put it on pre-sale here maybe later this week if I can get everything to work. It'll be certainly on Amazon. It'll eventually be on all the other sort of ebook sites, but expect it to be actually available in print at least around December the 10th, orderable at Amazon. I'm very, very close now, just working on the final appendix or two to the book, and so it should be available about December the 10th. So hopefully it'll be available just in time for you to order for Christmas.
Excellent. And I see that your cover artist Daniel Wright is in the chat room here at Spreaker.com. So Daniel, hurry up and get that finished, because we want to be able to post that to the website as soon as we can get a copy of the cover art.
He's doing better than me. He's actually been helpful, not just as a cover artist, but he's actually brought forward a number of things for me to look at. And Daniel's a rock star in my book.
He is a very deep thinker. He posts a lot of really well researched articles at some of the scholarly websites out there too. So beyond the artistic talents, he's also got some academic chops as well. So
indeed,
yeah. Doug Woodward is the author of the forthcoming book Rebooting the Bible, exposing the second century conspiracy to corrupt the Scripture and alter biblical chronology. Look forward to seeing the full text. We're blessed to have an early copy of it, and I look forward to digging through it, because again, this is the kind of stuff I really find fascinating, Doug. So I appreciate you getting us an early copy and sharing some of your thoughts about the work behind it.
Totally. Appreciate the opportunity, Derek, as always, to speak with you.
All right. Coming up in the next segment, we are going to talk about, a few final thoughts about this topic. We'll pick up where we left off at 7:30, and also we'll explain why adulting is hard. Or at least, if adulting is hard, maybe you can relax with the new Hasbro Monopoly for Millennials game and find out why it is triggering some of the aforesaid millennials. That's straight ahead as A View from the Bunker continues. I'm Derek Gilbert.
Churches and educational establishments from universities down to elementary schools are embracing New Age philosophy and are being seduced by heavy demonic forces that are masquerading as angels of light, ascended masters, spirit guides, and even Jesus Christ himself. Skywatch TV is proud to announce the second coming of the New Age official collection. When you order the new book, The Second Coming of the New Age by Stephen Bancars and Josh Peck, you'll receive the brand new DVD Beyond Supernatural, which includes never-before-released off-the-record interviews with the authors, detailing their long history of involvement with the New Age, and personal testimonies of their deliverance by Jesus Christ. And as a bonus, this DVD includes the entire Skywatch TV 5-part series exposing the infiltration of the New Age. Plus, you'll also receive on DVD The Book of Enoch, Fallen Angels, and Ancient Aliens, an exclusive production with Dr. Michael Heiser regarding the blatant lies of ancient astronaut theory and the horrifying nature of fallen angels and alien abduction. Also included is the brand new audio series, Doctrines of Devils. Listen as Stephen Bancars interviews Doreen Virtue, world-renowned former best-selling author and teacher for the New Age, as she explains her incredible supernatural journey out of the occult and into the arms of Jesus. This over 12-hour series features bonus interviews with Dr. Chuck Missler, Dr. Thomas Horn, John McTernan, Gary Bates, and many more on the subjects of ghosts, demons, and the supernatural. But that's not all. You'll also receive the oversized, beautifully republished classic masterpiece in hardback, Myths and Legends of Babylonia and Assyria. This work provides not only the account of the mysteries of the ancients, but extracts and presents to the reader the occultism driving much of the New Age and heretical doctrines today. Sold separately, these items hold a retail value of over $150. Yours now for your donation of only $35 plus shipping and handling. You can have access to everything you need to arm yourself against the onslaught of pervading spiritual darkness now. The Second Coming of the New Age official collection is available now at skywatchtvstore.com. Order now or call 1-844-750-4985.
Cutting-edge analysis of end times prophecy on the very ground where it all unfolds. It's the Skywatch TV Wars of the Gods Tour of Israel, May 12th through 23rd, 2019, hosted by Derek and Sharon Gilbert, and Pastor Carl Gallups, best-selling author of Gods and Thrones and Gods of Ground Zero, Messianic Rabbi Zev Porat of Messiah of Israel Ministries, and filmmakers Justin and Wes Fall, producers of the Hollow Earth Chronicles. This is a once-in-a-lifetime tour of the Holy Land from Mount Hermon to the Dead Sea. You'll walk in Jesus' footsteps on the battlegrounds of the supernatural war with preaching and teaching along the way. Shiloh, Bethel, Mount Carmel, Nazareth, the Jordan River, the Mount of Olives, Sea of Galilee, the Garden of Gethsemane, and Jerusalem, where the final battle will be fought for God's Mount of Assembly, Zion. The Skywatch TV Wars of the Gods Tour of Israel. Reserve your place now. For information and registration, log on to lipkintours.com. That's lipkintours.com. Driving the internet to think. Every Sunday Night Live, it's A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Remember, next week we talk about the occult underpinnings of these United States. It was a secret mission that Tom Horn took these gentlemen on earlier this summer, and has resulted in a shocking new documentary film called Belly of the Beast. Justin Fall and Wes Fall, Fall Brothers Productions, in association with Defender Films and Skywatch TV. We'll talk about that next Sunday night. That's November 25th here on A View from the Bunker Live, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. Central Time, UTC -6 if you're in another time zone. And, of course, all the archives available at VFTB.net. That's View from the Bunker, VFTB.net. Again, really interested in Doug's research here for the forthcoming book, Rebooting the Bible, because the chronology that he gets into in that research is something I've dug into quite a bit as I've been comparing the archaeology of the ancient Near East with the biblical narrative and finding that it's consistent. Now, we may not agree on the dates, but then scholars don't agree on the dates either. So, I've come up with a date of 1446 BC, which is a pretty conservative, safe estimate for the Exodus. 1446, with the actual invasion into Canaan, the attack on Jericho in 1406 BC. There are others, as he said, will move it into the 13th century BC because there's still some who believe that Ramses the Great was the pharaoh of the Exodus. You remember Yul Brynner from the movie? I don't think that's correct. I think that's too late. I think going older than that, back to the 17th century BC, I'm not in agreement there, but this is not a theological hill I'm going to die on. I think when we try to dial in too fine grain a resolution on some of these issues, we can blind ourselves. And that's what the whole point of the movie Patterns of Evidence was about, as scholars saying, well, we have to look for the destruction layer of Jericho in the 13th century BC. And since it's not there, then the Bible must be wrong. When we start looking at the patterns of history, we look at the things that have been found about the what scholars call the Uruk expansion. Uruk was the center of Nimrod's kingdom, and there's a period in the fourth millennium BC, so about roughly 4,000 BC or 3,900 BC down to about 3,000 BC, where this one city in southeastern Iraq, which by the way is the same name, Uruk in the Bible, it's Erech, same name. And think about that same name for that same piece of real estate for the last 6,000 years or thereabouts. That's pretty incredible. Anyway, what the Bible says about Nimrod going from there and expanding his kingdom up into Assyria, which is northern Iraq, the area around Mosul and Kirkuk, that's consistent with what archaeologists have found about the artifacts that come from this ancient city-state called Uruk. Do we know the exact years when this happened? No, because writing hadn't been invented yet, or at least none that we've been able to find so far. But they found evidence of warfare as far away as an ancient city called Hamukar, which is in far northeastern Syria. It's like the border zone between Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. And they date the destruction of that city to about 3,500 BC, right in the middle of the Uruk expansion. The oldest evidence of urban warfare, it's been called. The invaders from Uruk, the kingdom of Nimrod, apparently used clay bullets and clay cannonballs fired from slings to take down the defenders. But again, do we know that was Nimrod? No. Do we know what year exactly it happened? No. But when we step back and look at the big pattern, that first there was the flood, then there was the Tower of Babel incident sometime later, and then later you had the rise of the Amorite states and the culture that produced the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The pattern fits. We don't have the exact dates, but the Bible is not a history book per se. It is a theology book based on history. The patterns fit. So we can disagree over the dates a little bit, although I'm still right. Anyway, I say that in love because I respect Doug as a researcher and a writer, and looking forward to getting through the rest of his book here. The Septuagint translation has a lot to recommend it, and one of the things, and Doug brought up something I was going to mention here anyway, and I'll just reiterate his point, that the English Standard Version, the ESV translation, uses the Septuagint especially in places where it makes more sense than the Masoretic text. And one of the key verses, and this is something Dr. Michael Heiser brings out in his book, The Unseen Realm, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, is different in most of our English translations than it is in the ESV, because the ESV translators opted to go with the version from the Septuagint and also in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Deuteronomy 32, verse 8, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, and this is a reference to the Tower of Babel incident and the division of languages after the tower, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Most English translations say according to the number of the sons of Israel. But that's not what's in the Septuagint or the Dead Sea Scrolls translation, the Dead Sea Scrolls version of the book of Deuteronomy, which is considerably older by at least 700 or 800 years than the Masoretic text. The reason that's important is because it reinforces the divine council worldview, the idea that there were other small g gods or small e Elohim who were created beings, created by Yahweh, and who were delegated authority by God. He essentially allotted them to the nations as the gods of the nations. And you find reference to that in Deuteronomy 4, verses 19 and 20, and elsewhere. Exodus 12:12 makes reference to the gods of Egypt. God telling Moses, on this night when I pass through the land of Egypt, I will execute judgments on all the gods of Egypt. So God in the Bible calls them gods. In the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, again, Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, drawing on the Septuagint, which again is the version translated from older Hebrew texts into Greek sometime 200 or 300 years before the birth of Jesus. So that's why Doug is writing this. And again, the the history of the early 2nd century and the Bar Kokhba revolt, where Simon Bar Kokhba led what was initially a very successful rebellion against Rome, which is remarkable considering the power of the Roman legions. Even at the time of Hadrian in the early 2nd century, Rome was still one of the 2 most powerful empires on the planet, if not the most powerful. I mean, they never defeated the Parthians, but they at least held them to a standoff. And the Jews under Bar Kokhba basically destroyed the legions that were in Judea at the time, which is why Hadrian called up his best generals and sent a massive force into Judea and depopulated the land, basically destroyed any hope of an independent Jewish state in Judea for almost 2,000 years. That's how frustrated the Roman Empire and the Emperor Hadrian was with the Jewish rebels. But as I understand the history of the early 2nd century, the leader of the rebellion, Simon Bar Kokhba, essentially made an ultimatum to the Christians living in Judea: either fight with us or else. And Christians said, we know who the Messiah is, and that was Jesus of Nazareth. So you are not the Messiah. We are not going to fight for you if you're claiming to be the Messiah. And so many Christians under Bar Kokhba were imprisoned and some killed. And that is what led to the final break between Jews and Christians in the ancient world, and led to, sadly, the animosity that has been evident between Jews and Christians for the last 2 millennia. It's certainly the work of the enemy. And by the enemy, I mean principalities, powers, cosmic rulers of this present darkness, the spiritual entities that are our true enemies, not the human people who sometimes do their bidding and sometimes do it unwittingly. Anyway, that was really what drove the final wedge between Christians and Jews, was the Bar Kokhba revolt and the refusal of Christians to fight in the rebellion against Rome. In the first half hour, we brought up a story, or I brought up a story. I was speaking in the third person, the collective we. I brought up a story that I want to come back to because I just find this so disturbing, and I see this as evidence of the enemy. And again, when I say enemy, I'm not speaking of human opponents here. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, remember. But the enemy's long game to deconstruct God's creation, and the pinnacle of God's creation being humankind, man and woman. From the beginning created he them, male and female. We're being told now that is not a fixed thing, that your gender is not determined by your biology, by your genetic makeup, but by how you feel on any given day. And sadly, kids, teenagers who often feel awkward in their own skin, like they don't fit in, are being used and manipulated as part of this agenda. And this story was prompted by a report in the Daily Mail out of the UK that a 20-year veteran teacher who was afraid of using her real name in the story because of she's afraid of retribution, recriminations, afraid of losing her job, said that she has been told not to tell parents or other teachers if a student comes to her and says, I'm a boy, but I feel like I'm in a girl's body, or vice versa. If a student claims to be transgender, this teacher has said, keep this information from parents. She told the Daily Mail that older students who have changed gender are grooming younger students to do the same, and that many of the students who are claiming to be transgender are actually autistic and are being encouraged to use gender dysphoria as a way to solve their problems. Hey, all of your problems will go away if you will just take these drugs and have this surgery. And as I mentioned in the first segment, the statistics put forward by activists in the LGBTQ plus community, they admit that 41% of the people who claim to be transgender will attempt suicide at some point. In the general population, I think that number is like 6%, and that might be high. So there's a huge difference. Of course, activists will say it's because of people like me who are haters, which is not the case at all, because I think what is happening is tragic, because someone who feels that they are the wrong gender trapped in the wrong body is in need of help, counseling, and love, not affirmation, not encouragement to join a lifestyle that they're going to regret. I've had the opportunity to interview a gentleman named Walt Heyer, Heyer. You can find his interview in the archives here at VFTB.net, who underwent sex reassignment surgery when he was in his 40s, lived as a woman for some years, and then realized that he still had the same problems that he had before, the same emotional issues, the same psychological issues, baggage from a troubled childhood, except that now he still had the problems, but he was surgically mutilated. So it was worse. And sadly, that is the path that these activists are putting these kids on. I mentioned a study by Brown University. This was published back in August, and almost immediately, Brown University was pressured to apologize for it, because a condition that researchers are calling rapid onset gender dysphoria. Again, this wasn't even a thing 10 years ago. But over the last decade, the number of teenagers coming forward and saying, yeah, I'm the wrong gender, has skyrocketed. And so a researcher at Brown University began questioning parents. What's going on? And put together a survey to find out, are there some common threads that tie together these kids who are coming forward and claiming to be transgender. And the survey shows, the study shows that it may be what the researcher called a social contagion, linked with having friends who identify as LGBT, and pressure, grooming from activists who are using social media and messaging apps to get a hold of kids who are troubled. Again, all of us, if you remember back to when you're 12, 13, 14 years old, all of us feel like nobody understands me. My parents hate me. My life stinks. And then you've got these people coming in and giving you some positive affirmation via the internet now, people that parents don't even know about. I mean, you think about this, thanks to smartphones and the internet, people are entering our kids' bedrooms that we have no idea who they are. People that we would never have let past the front door, our parents would have never let past the front door, are now getting right into the bedrooms of our kids at night and encouraging them to go down this path at the end, which for far too many of them will end in drug abuse or suicide, drug, alcohol abuse or suicide. Anyway, when Brown University published this study, transgender activists went nuts because it reinforces what a lot of parents, doctors, and public health experts are saying, which is essentially that transgenderism is a fad and a dangerous one. But sadly, the study by Lisa Littman, Littman, who's a professor of behavior and social sciences at Brown, and an OBGYN whose publications are mainly reproductive health and abortion, Brown University backed down and apologized. So this is the world in which we live, sadly. But again, remember, the people who are identifying as transgender are not the enemy. They need help. They need love. And that was a message that Walt Heyer had for me. He said it took a courageous pastor who was willing to love him where he was and share the love of Christ with him that got him to accept who he was, to get past the emotional and psychological baggage he'd been carrying for decades, and to begin living as the way in the body that God created him with. But it is tragic because we're going to see many more lives destroyed because of this movement and because of the positive images that are put forward by Hollywood, by the music industry. In fact, Celine Dion just announced that she's launched a gender-neutral line of baby clothing. Now, that seems harmless enough, but it's all part and parcel of this movement. Let's let kids decide for themselves who they are. And if you want to be something different tomorrow, though, that's fine, too, because gender is fluid, and it's on a scale, and it changes from day to day. And if you use the wrong pronoun, all right, fine. But again, as Christians, we have to be prepared to respond with love, because if they see us coming with hatred in our eyes, we're going to drive them farther from the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as with you and me, they need Jesus. That's really the only solution to all of this. And sadly, as Brown withdraws that story, about 6 weeks ago, no, it's about 2 months ago, back in September, a pediatric endocrinologist in Atlanta talked with Breitbart News and said that there's a study that's about to come out from the National Institutes of Health, funded by taxpayers, funded by you and me, that will conclude that affirming young children with gender dysphoria by providing them with puberty-blocking drugs and ultimately sterilizing them is not only safe, but necessary for them to be happy. Again, I believe it's all part of a long game of deconstructing God's creation. From the beginning, male and female created he them. The enemy wants us to reject that definition and to ultimately to destroy ourselves. And sadly, the shapers of our culture in Hollywood and in the music industry have embraced this. Tragic. Well, one final story, and this made me laugh out loud, and I think what's even funnier is that that there are people actually protesting this. Hasbro has put out a new edition of the board game Monopoly, and there are all kinds of editions of Monopoly out there. So every time there's a new fad, a hit movie, television series, whatever, it comes along, a new edition of Monopoly hits the shelves, which is kind of cool. Got good memories of playing Monopoly, as a family back in the day. Some bitter memories as well, friends who always, cheated. It's like, oh yeah, we did say that we could collect the money on free parking. Wait a minute. Anyway, the new edition that is causing so much distress among people under the age of about 35 or 30 is Monopoly for Millennials, because the marketing phrase is, adulting is hard. You deserve a break from the rat races. It features a picture of rich Uncle Pennybags taking a selfie, wearing Ray-Bans and holding a to-go cup of coffee. In front of a vegan restaurant. And he's got earbuds in, so totally millennial. Game tokens in this version of Monopoly include emojis, a camera, a bike, a hashtag, and, of course, sunglasses. The price tag of the new edition of Monopoly, $19.82, which is a reference to the first year of the millennial generation. And the spaces on the board no longer include real estate. So the point of the game is to collect experiences, not real estate, because, according to Hasbro, you can't afford it anyway. So the message to millennials, go through the game and spend time on your friend's couch, or go to the vegan bistro, or on another square you get a week-long meditation retreat. Forget real estate. You can't afford it anyway. Well, millennials are not happy about this. A 28-year-old from Minnesota went on Facebook and criticized Hasbro, saying this is one of the biggest game companies in the world, making the fact that property ownership is impossible for most people my age into a jeering tagline. It's patronizing. Well, suck it up, Buttercup. Just laugh at yourself. Look, I couldn't afford a house when I was 28 either, but just laugh, and you'll get by a lot better in life. There is a point to be made there, but going into the economic implications of the real estate market is beyond the scope of this program, because we're down to the final 5 minutes or so. So we'll deal with that some other time. But anyway, just found it rather amusing that millennials are being triggered by new Monopoly for Millennials. It's a joke. It's a joke. Get over yourselves. We've got a bunch of things coming up in the new year as we get into 2019. 2019 already. Conferences already on the calendar for the new year. The Hear the Watchman Conference coming back to Dallas March 28th through 31st. This is at the Hilton DFW Lakes Conference Center in Grapevine, Texas. Pastor Carl Gallups will be there. Rabbi Zev Parat will be coming over from Tel Aviv. And, of course, we'll be seeing them not long after that again back in Israel. L.A. Marzulli, Russ Dizdar, Pastor Paul Begley, Dr. Michael Lake, Pastor Casper McLeod, Coach Dave Daubenmeier, Lynn Liaz, Lisa Haven, Michael Bodea, and more. Again, Hear the Watchman, Dallas, March 28th through 31st of 2019. If you want information and to register early, you can do that at hearthewatchman.com. The True Legends Conference returning to Branson, Missouri in September 13th through the 15th of 2019. Answering the alien question, dealing with UFOs. On this one, should be fascinating, and Sharon and I will be there in some capacity. Looking forward to that, and always happy to attend conferences that are right in our backyard here in Branson. So we will hopefully see you there for that one. And what else? Oh, yes. We're going to San Antonio next October. The I-4029 Conference. That's a reference to Isaiah 40, verse 29. This is a new one. This is at the Grand Hyatt in San Antonio, October 4th through the 6th of 2019. L.A. Marzulli, Russ Dizdar, Bill Salas already signed up for this. We'll give you more information as we get closer to that date, but mark out your calendar. First weekend in October for the I-4029 Conference. Sharon and I will both be there for that. And, of course, Israel, the Skywatch TV Wars of the Gods Tour of Israel, May 12th through 23rd of 2019. For information and to get your spot saved on the bus, log on to lipkintours.com. Leave us a review on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever else you find us. Of course, we are wherever fine podcasts are sold. Give us a like at the View from the Bunker page on Facebook. And remember, A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. The opening theme is Iron Bacon by Kevin MacLeod. His website is incompetech.com. Our announcer is D.C. Good. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert. Thanks for listening. This is A View from the Bunker.